The Butcher's Bloody Legacy. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a notorious serial killer in criminal history. Born on October 16, 1936 in Ukraine, Andrei committed heinous crimes over a decade from 1978 to 1990. He sexually assaulted, murdered, and mutilated at least 52 women and children across the Soviet Union, earning him nicknames like the Rostov Ripper and the Red Ripper. Andrei's crimes were brutal and precise. He confessed to 56 murders but was tried for 53. His trial in April 1992 gained global attention, leading to his conviction and execution by gunshot in February 1994. His crimes had a significant impact on the Soviet criminal justice system. Most of Andrei's murders took place in the Rostov Oblast, where he lured victims to isolated locations. He stabbed, slashed, and eviscerated his victims, leaving horrific crime scenes. Andrei managed to avoid capture for many years, adding to the mystery surrounding him. The investigation into Andrei's crimes faced several obstacles, including mistakes by law enforcement and wrongful convictions due to misidentified suspects. The scale and duration of his crimes raised questions about the effectiveness of surveillance and law enforcement in the Soviet era. Grim beginnings. Andrei was born in 1936 in Yablukne, Ukraine, during a time of severe hardship caused by the Soviet Union's forced collectivization policies. His family experienced extreme poverty, living in a one-room hut with limited resources. Andrei later described eating grass and leaves to survive, illustrating the dire conditions of his childhood. Andrei's mother told him stories about his older brother who was allegedly killed and eaten by neighbors during the famine. Although unconfirmed, these narratives of cannibalism and survival had a significant impact on Andrei's psychological development, and were later cited as influential factors in his disturbed behavior. Roman, Andrei's father, was a former prisoner of war, a status that brought shame and further ostracization to the family within their community. Roman's frequent absences left Andrei to navigate his formative years, primarily with a harsh and distant mother. The lack of a stable paternal figure and the stigma of his father's past contributed to Andrei's growing sense of isolation. The severe hardships and social stigmas Andrei experienced during his early childhood were not mere episodes of poverty, but formative experiences that profoundly influenced his understanding of power, control, and survival. These elements, combined with his later personal and sexual frustrations, likely played a role in shaping his future criminal behavior. The War and its Shadows. World War II brought additional trauma to Andrei Chikatilo's already troubled childhood. During the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, Andrei witnessed atrocities that deeply impacted him. His village was often caught in the crossfire of advancing and retreating armies, and Andrei and his mother survived bombings and violence. These experiences instilled a profound sense of fear and distrust in Andrei. In one instance, Andrei and his mother watched their own hut burn down, a vivid memory he recounted later in life. Such events emphasized the fragility of safety and the harsh realities of power to him. The violence of war also directly impacted Andrei's immediate family. According to his later accounts, German soldiers raped his mother, resulting in the birth of his sister Tatiana. Witnessing this violation at a young age exposed Andrei to the most brutal forms of human behavior and potentially linked notions of sex and violence in his developing mind, which may have influenced his later criminal behavior. The absence of Andrei's father, who was taken prisoner during the war, left the family vulnerable and further ostracized by their community. The combined effects of war, family disruption, and social disgrace likely contributed to Andrei's feelings of anger, resentment, and confusion. Andrei Chikatilo's later life and crimes can be viewed as a distorted attempt to regain power and control, shaped by the early chaos and trauma he experienced during World War II. These experiences, combined with his pre-existing hardships, had a significant impact on his psychological development. Early signs of turmoil. Andrei faced additional challenges when he started school in 1944. He was physically frail and poorly dressed, making him a target for bullies. Although his academic performance was generally good, his social struggles often overshadowed his achievements. The persistent bullying exacerbated his feelings of inadequacy and alienation, shaping his perception of himself and others and reinforcing his sense of powerlessness and isolation. Andrei's home life provided no respite, as his mother subjected him to constant berating and physical abuse for his persistent bedwetting problem, which lasted into his adolescence. This abuse deepened his sense of worthlessness and instilled a fear and hatred towards authoritative figures, particularly women, which may have influenced his later crimes against women and children. Andrei's early attempts at romantic relationships were hindered by his timidity, physical awkwardness, and impotence, which became apparent as he reached adulthood. These sexual failures embarrassed and frustrated him, potentially pushing him towards more destructive expressions of sexuality. His inability to form healthy relationships was a significant psychological setback that may have contributed to his desire to compensate through a violent control. Early signs of Andrei's disturbing behavior were evident in his adolescent years. He was reported to have engaged in voyeurism, spying on his peers, particularly females, which indicated a distorted sexual development. These behaviors were precursors to his later violent acts and suggested a long-standing pattern of disturbed behavior rooted in his troubled childhood and adolescence. The mask of normalcy. Despite his educated background and seemingly ordinary Soviet life, Andrei Chikatilo harbored dark impulses that were at odds with his outward persona. After obtaining a degree in Russian literature, Andrei became a school teacher. However, this role, which should have grounded him in the community, instead revealed his deeper psychological conflicts. Andrei struggled to control his classes, reflecting his internal chaos and revealing a man losing grip on his conventional life. His interactions with students were troubling, marked by inappropriate intrusions and a disturbing interest in their personal space. Despite complaints and several alarming incidents, including assaults on students, the system's failure to take decisive action against him allowed his predatory behavior to escalate unchecked. This lack of intervention can be attributed to the bureaucratic inertia of the time, which often overlooked signs of deviance in seemingly respectable individuals. Andrei's personal life also reflected this duality. Although married with children, his domestic life was plagued by struggles with his sexual identity and impotence, which tormented him. These personal crises were critical in driving him towards acts of violence, as they intensified his feelings of inadequacy and anger. The inability to reconcile his public persona with his private turmoil created a dangerous divide within his psyche. The tension between Andrei's public role as a teacher and his private failures led to a deep sense of resentment and alienation. Feeling powerless in his legitimate roles, both at home and at work, he paradoxically sought control and dominance through horrific means. This quest for power would soon manifest in a series of chilling crimes, marking his complete descent into darkness. The first crimes. Andrei Chikatilo's first known sexual assault, committed against a teenage student in 1973, marked the beginning of his transition from a troubled individual to a violent criminal. This assault was not an isolated incident, but a grim indication of his future path. The act was characterized by a disturbing combination of violence and sexual gratification, setting the pattern for his subsequent offenses. Andrei often used his position or the guise of kindness to lure his victims, who were mostly vulnerable individuals, such as runaways or young vagrants. His first murder in 1978, in which he lured a 9-year-old girl to an abandoned house under the pretense of friendship, was a significant turning point. When he failed to achieve sexual arousal through conventional means during the crime, he resorted to murder and discovered a disturbing form of satisfaction in the act of killing itself. The aftermath of this first murder did not deter Andrei. Instead, it emboldened him as he realized he could evade detection. The wrongful conviction of another man for his crime reinforced his sense of invulnerability, a dangerous misconception that fueled his confidence to continue his murderous spree. During this period, Andrei began to refine his methods, becoming increasingly bold and meticulous in his approach to both luring victims and evading capture. As Andrei's crimes escalated, so did the brutality and frequency of his murders. With each victim, he descended further into depravity, driven by a compulsion that seemed to defy understanding. His killings were not just acts of physical violence, but elaborate rituals that satisfied his twisted desires, reflecting a complete break from any sense of humanity. Spiral of violence. By the early 1980s, Andrei Chikatilo's murderous impulses had escalated, leading to an increase in both the frequency and brutality of his attacks. He traveled across the Soviet Union using his job's travel requirements as a cover for his criminal activities. Each new location provided him with new opportunities to prey on unsuspecting victims, exploiting the mobility his profession afforded him to leave a trail of atrocities across multiple regions. The nature of Andrei's crimes became increasingly horrific, with him often mutilating his victims in shocking ways. One of his signature acts of brutality was gouging out the eyes of his victims, a macabre tactic driven by a superstitious belief that the image of the killer would be captured in the eyes of the deceased. This particular form of mutilation magnified the horror of his acts and underscored the deep-seated psychological disturbance that drove him. As the number of victims increased, law enforcement agencies faced mounting pressure to apprehend the perpetrator. As the 1980s progressed, Andrei Chikatilo's mental state visibly deteriorated, coinciding with an increase in the frequency and brutality of his murders. His method of killing evolved from simple stabbing or strangulation to prolonged torture before delivering the fatal blows. This escalation reflected his losing battle with his own sanity, as each act of violence pushed him further into a psychological abyss. Over time, Andrei's choice of victims became less discriminate. While he initially targeted primarily young women and children, he expanded his scope to include boys and occasionally adult men. This shift was indicative of his growing desperation and loss of control as he transformed from a calculated predator to a frantic, compulsive killer, driven by an insatiable urge for violence. Andrei's tools were simple yet effective, typically consisting of knives, ropes, and occasionally blunt instruments. Each item was chosen for its availability and lethality. His modus operandi often involved binding his victims, which not only prevented escape but also added a layer of control and dominance over them, crucial aspects for his twisted satisfaction. Psychologically, Andrei was unraveling. He often conversed with his victims, attempting to justify his actions or even seeking their forgiveness before killing them. These conversations provided a disturbing glimpse into his fractured mind, filled with delusions and a desperate attempt to find meaning in his senseless acts. This period of his life was marked by an alarming detachment from reality, as the line between his desires and his actions blurred into non-existence. The surveillance snare. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was aware that a serial killer was at large, prompting a massive, though initially uncoordinated effort across various law enforcement agencies. The investigation, hindered by early missteps, including the wrongful arrest of others, was under immense pressure. This led to a more methodical approach, combining forces from different regions and focusing on the patterns that were gradually emerging from the chaos of the crime scenes. The establishment of a special task force was crucial. This team, composed of experienced investigators, forensic experts, and psychologists, began reanalyzing all available evidence using new techniques. They employed psychological profiling, a relatively new tool in Soviet law enforcement, to narrow down the type of individual who could commit such heinous acts. The profile suggested a middle-aged man, seemingly ordinary, with a job that required travel, which could explain the widespread locations of the murders. Data from various crime scenes were meticulously cross-referenced to establish a timeline and pattern of movements of the suspect. The killer's method of luring victims from train stations and bus stops into secluded areas became a significant focus. Law enforcement began extensive surveillance of these transit points, hoping to catch the killer in the act or gather more clues. Despite the advanced efforts and coordination, the killer remained elusive. Each new victim added urgency and frustration to the hunt. The investigators had to balance their approach between following the psychological profile and considering the possibility that the killer might alter his methods as the manhunt intensified. This period of the investigation was characterized by a tense atmosphere of hope, mixed with the grim reality of ongoing violence. In response to the growing number of victims and increasing public fear, the task force decided to implement a bold surveillance strategy in 1990 called Operation La Sapalosa, Forest Strip. This plan involved deploying undercover agents at key transportation hubs known to be the killer's hunting grounds. The operation was risky and required significant resources, but the urgency of the situation warranted this extensive approach. Undercover officers, disguised as passengers and homeless people, monitored suspicious activities. Cameras were installed in strategic locations, capturing thousands of hours of footage that needed to be carefully reviewed, a task that was both time-consuming and psychologically taxing, given the nature of the images they sometimes captured. The operation also utilized baiting tactics, where officers posed as potential victims to lure the suspect into a trap. These tactics were controversial, but stemmed from a desperate need to stop further killings. Meanwhile, psychologists continued to refine the profile of the killer using insights gained from new victims and the behaviors observed by undercover agents. This intensive phase of the investigation put enormous pressure on the task force. Officers worked around the clock, often under great psychological strain, haunted by the knowledge that any failure could result in more lives lost. The stakes were incredibly high, and the shadow of the killer loomed large over their every move. The final capture. The breakthrough finally came on November 6, 1990. An undercover officer noticed a man, later identified as Andrei Chikatilo, appearing suspicious at the Donlisko's station. His behavior was consistent with the psychological profile. He approached young passengers, engaging them in conversation, then moved on if they seemed wary. The officer followed Andrei as he left the station and apprehended him after observing his continued suspicious activities. Andrei was arrested and a search revealed items linking him to the crimes, including a knife and rope in his possession. His appearance and belongings matched descriptions and evidence gathered during the surveillance operations. This was the moment the task force had been working towards, the culmination of years of relentless investigation, psychological profiling, and innovative police work. Following his arrest, Andrei's home was searched, yielding further incriminating evidence. He eventually confessed to multiple murders, providing details only the killer could know. In December 1990, Andrei led police to the body of Alexei Kobatov, a boy he had confessed to killing and had buried on the outskirts of a Shakhty cemetery. This discovery provided irrefutable proof that Andrei was the killer. He later guided investigators to the bodies of 2 more victims he had confessed to murdering. Although 3 of the 56 victims Andrei confessed to killing could not be located or identified, he was ultimately charged with the murders of 53 women and children between 1978 and 1990. He awaited trial in the same cell in Rostov where he had been detained since November. The trial of the century. Andrei's trial began on April 14, 1992, in Rostov-on-Don, Russia. It was one of the first publicly accessible trials in post-Soviet Russia and attracted significant media attention. Held in courtroom number 5 of the Rostov Provincial Court, the trial was presided over by Judge Leonid Akubzhanov and followed by millions. The courtroom was often chaotic, filled with the anguished cries of victims' families and the eerie calmness of the accused, who sat in an iron cage to protect him from the victims' enraged relatives. The first 2 days of the trial were dedicated to reading the long list of indictments against Andrei. Each murder was discussed individually, and the details of the crimes caused many in the courtroom to faint or break down in tears. As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented a wealth of evidence, including forensic reports, witness testimonies, and Andrei's own confessions. Throughout the proceedings, Andrei's behavior was erratic. He alternated between cooperating with the court and claiming his innocence, often going into graphic detail about the murders during his testimony. His defense lawyer, Marat Kabibulin, argued that Andrei was insane and should not be held responsible for his actions. However, psychiatric experts testified that while Andrei suffered from borderline personality disorder with sadistic features, he was sane and fit to stand trial. The trial lasted until October 1992, with the court hearing testimony from numerous experts, witnesses, and relatives of the victims. The prosecution sought the death penalty, while the defense maintained that Andrei was mentally ill and should be spared execution. On October 14, 1992, after a trial that lasted nearly 6 months, Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders and 5 counts of sexual assault. He was sentenced to death for each of the murder charges and an additional 86 years in prison for the sexual assaults. On February 14, 1994, Andrei was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head, marking the end of one of the most notorious serial killer cases in modern history. A psychological enigma. Analyzing Andrei Chikatilo's psychology is a complex task. His early life was marked by hardship and violence, which may have influenced his later criminal behavior. Born in post-famine Ukraine, Andrei's childhood was shaped by deprivation and exposure to traumatic wartime stories, including unverified tales of cannibalism. These experiences, particularly the story of his brother's alleged death, likely impacted his psychological development. Andrei's adult life was characterized by chronic impotence, which caused him significant personal and social distress. This impotence is believed to have been a driving factor in his crimes, as he sought control and domination through violence. His first known assault on a 15-year-old student involved overpowering the victim rather than sexual contact. suggesting a link between his sexual dysfunction and violent behavior. Psychologists developed a profile of Andrei during the investigation, revealing him as a man of contradictions. Despite his education and seemingly mild-mannered demeanor, he harbored sadistic tendencies. The profile suggested that his killings were sexually motivated, with his knife serving as a substitute for the sexual organ he could not use effectively. This theory provided a disturbing but crucial insight into his motivations. During his trial, Andrei's behavior was erratic, alternating between calm admissions of guilt and angry denials. This prompted a thorough psychological evaluation to determine his mental competence. The results were unsettling and sometimes inconclusive, with some aspects of his personality fitting clinical categories, while others remained puzzling. This ambiguity contributed to his notoriety as an enigmatic figure in criminal psychology. Andrei Chikatilo's case continues to be studied as a benchmark in forensic psychology, offering insights into the complex relationship between psychological disorders and criminal behavior. What role do you think Chikatilo's childhood experiences and upbringing played in shaping his criminal behavior? In your opinion, what could have been done differently in the investigation and trial to ensure a swifter resolution to the case? Please remember to subscribe to the channel to receive automatic reminders of all of our future videos. Also, if you want early access to ad-free and uncensored versions of all Wicked videos, feel free to become a channel member. Becoming a member will also give you access to exclusive emotes and badges, which you can flex in the comments and during our live streams. Thank you for watching, and join us next time when we explore the psychological maze of some of the most wicked people.